Researchers request human collaboration because we think differently. Part 1. The ships appeared over Geneva on a Tuesday morning, and they were wrong in a way that made people's eyes water. They looked like crystal, but the light that bounced off them moved in directions that shouldn't exist. Some people who stared too long said they could see colors that didn't have names. The Swiss military scrambled jets, but the pilots reported that their instruments couldn't agree on how far away the objects were, or even if they were really there at all. Dr. Sarah was eating breakfast in her small apartment when her phone exploded with notifications. She taught physics at the university, specializing in quantum mechanics and consciousness studies. Most people thought her work was interesting but useless. She'd spent 15 years trying to understand why human intuition sometimes solved problems that pure mathematics couldn't touch. Her colleagues were polite about it, but she knew they thought she was chasing ghosts. The email that changed everything came at 9:47 a.m. The sender was listed as Consortium Dimensional Research Initiative. Sarah almost deleted it as spam, but something made her open it. The message was in English, perfect English, but reading it felt like trying to understand a song by looking at sheet music. The words were right, but they carried meanings that English wasn't built to hold. The email explained that the consortium represented 7 civilizations from adjacent dimensions. They were researchers, scientists, explorers of reality itself. For 300 years, they had been studying a problem that threatened everything. The fabric of reality was tearing. Fractures were appearing between dimensions, growing wider each year. If they couldn't stop it, every dimension would eventually collapse into chaos. The email said they needed humanity's help, not humanity's technology, which was primitive by their standards, not humanity's mathematics, which they'd already surpassed ago. They needed the way humans think. They needed human minds. Sarah read the email 3 times. Then she called the number at the bottom, which turned out to be the direct line to the UN Secretary General. The woman who answered sounded tired and overwhelmed, but she confirmed that yes, this was real. No, they didn't understand it either. Yes, Doctor was one of 200 scientists being invited to a meeting that afternoon. The meeting took place in a conference room that the aliens had constructed in the space of 3 hours. It existed in what they called a pocket dimension, a bubble of reality slightly sideways from normal space. Walking into it felt like stepping through a curtain of warm water. The room was huge, with walls that seemed to stretch further than they should. Beings from 7 different dimensions waited inside. Sarah tried not to stare, but it was impossible. Some of the aliens looked almost normal, just oddly proportioned or colored. Others hurt to look at directly. One seemed to exist in 4 spatial dimensions at once, so that looking at it from different angles showed completely different creatures. Another was made of something like living crystal that sang in frequencies that made Sarah's teeth ache. A third looked like it was constantly falling through itself, a loop of movement that never quite completed. The leader introduced itself as Sarah's brain insisted was roughly humanoid, about 7 feet tall, with skin that shifted between blue and purple. But she suspected that wasn't what really looked like. Her mind was just translating something it couldn't process into something familiar. His voice came through a translation device that rendered it into English, but with odd pauses and emphases, as if the device was struggling with concepts that didn't quite fit. "We thank you for coming," said. "We know this is strange and frightening. We will try to explain." Activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room. It showed something like a map, but in more dimensions than Sarah could count. Threads of different colors wove through space, representing different dimensions, but the threads were fraying. Gaps appeared in the weave, spreading like tears in fabric. "This is the multiverse," explained. "Each thread is a dimension, a complete universe with its own laws of physics. For most of history, the dimensions were stable, separate. But 3 centuries ago, we learned to travel between them. Since then, the barriers have been breaking down. These fractures grow worse each year. We calculate that within 200 years, the damage will be irreversible. All dimensions will collapse into a single chaotic state where no organized matter can exist. A scientist from Japan raised his hand. You've been studying this for 300 years. You can travel between dimensions. Your technology is obviously far beyond ours. Why do you need our help? Made a gesture that might have been a nod. A good question, let me show you something. The display changed, showing what looked like brain scans. This is how a mind processes a problem. You see the ordered progression. Data enters here, travels through logical pathways, and produces a conclusion. Very efficient, very reliable. The display shifted to show scans from the other species present. Each one showed orderly patterns, elegant flows of information moving through systematic channels, then showed a human brain scan. It looked like chaos. Activity flared up in random areas, jumped between regions with no apparent logic, created patterns that dissolved and reformed. Compared to the alien scans, the human brain looked like it was malfunctioning. This is how a human solves the same problem, said. You see the disorder, the seemingly random activation. We have studied 200 species across 7 dimensions. None of them think like you do. You are unique. A woman from Brazil, a mathematician, frowned. You're saying our brains are broken. No, said, and something in the translation suggested deep emotion. We are saying you are different. Every species we have studied thinks logically. They process information in orderly ways. They proceed from evidence to conclusion through clear steps, and every single one of them has failed to solve the fracture problem. Pulled up more displays, showing attempts by various civilizations to fix the fractures. Sarah saw energy beings who approached reality like a math equation. She saw hive mind species that could process information across billions of nodes simultaneously. She saw artificial intelligences that could simulate entire universes to predict outcomes. All of them had tried to stop the fractures. All of them had failed. We have tried everything we can imagine, continued. We have applied every logical framework, every mathematical model, every simulation. Nothing works. Some attempts make the problem worse. We are trapped by our own way of thinking. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was beginning to understand. You can't solve it because you're too logical. You need us because we're not. Precisely, said. We have observed humans from a distance for 50 of your years. You solve problems in ways that should not work. You make leaps of intuition that skip over necessary logical steps, yet somehow arrive at correct answers. You see patterns that do not exist mathematically but lead to real solutions. You create stories, metaphors, art, and somehow extract truth from fiction. You trust feelings over data. You guess when you should calculate. You are, by our standards, completely irrational. Another scientist, a man from India, laughed nervously. That doesn't sound like a compliment. His form shifted in a way that might have been a smile. It is the highest compliment we can give. We are dying because we are too rational, too logical, too perfect in our thinking. We need minds that are broken in the right ways. We need human minds. The room fell silent as the scientists absorbed this. Sarah looked around at her colleagues, seeing the mix of pride and fear on their faces. They were being told that humanity's supposed weakness, their messy, intuitive, illogical way of thinking, might be the key to saving multiple universes. What exactly do you want us to do? Sarah asked. Work with us, said simply. Bring your broken, beautiful human thinking to our problem. Look at our data with your irrational eyes. Apply your intuition to our logic. We will provide everything you need: facilities, resources, access to our technology and knowledge. All we ask is that you think the way only humans can think. Paused, and the translation device seemed to struggle with what came next. We are afraid, finally said. We have exhausted every logical approach. We are asking you to do something that frightens us deeply, to trust in methods we do not understand, to abandon pure reason in favor of instinct. But we are more afraid of doing nothing while reality dies around us. Sarah looked at the holographic display, at the spreading fractures in the fabric of the multiverse. She thought about 8 billion humans going about their lives, unaware that existence itself was tearing apart. She thought about her own research, her attempts to prove that human intuition was valuable, that feelings and hunches and creative leaps mattered. Maybe she'd been right all along. Maybe humanity's greatest strength was being beautifully, impossibly broken. "When do we start?" she asked. Relief was visible across species and dimensions. "Immediately, if you are willing. We have prepared a research facility in a neutral pocket dimension. You and your colleagues will work alongside our finest minds. Together, perhaps we can achieve what neither of us could do alone." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Around the room, other scientists were nodding too, accepting the impossible task. They were going to save the multiverse by thinking sideways, by guessing instead of calculating, by trusting their gut instead of the numbers. They were going to do it by being human. Part 2. The research facility existed in a place that shouldn't exist, a pocket dimension carved out of the space between spaces. Walking into it for the first time made Sarah's stomach lurch, as if she'd stepped off a cliff and was falling in all directions at once. Then the sensation passed, and she found herself in what looked like the world's most advanced laboratory crossed with something from a dream. The facility was enormous, with rooms that seemed to change size depending on how you looked at them. The walls glowed with a soft light that didn't cast shadows. Workstations appeared to be carved from single pieces of impossible materials, and holographic displays floated in the air without any visible projectors. The consortium had explained that the laws of physics here were adjustable, like settings on a machine. Gravity could be increased or decreased. Time could be sped up or slowed down in different areas. It was a researcher's paradise, and Sarah knew it would take her weeks just to understand how to use the bathroom. 200 human scientists joined her over the first few days, representing every major field and dozens of countries. They worked alongside researchers from 7 different dimensional civilizations. The culture shock went in both directions. The first major incident happened within a week. The consortium presented the human team with a massive data set describing the dimensional fractures. It was beautiful work, elegant mathematics describing how reality was slowly coming apart at the seams. The equations filled holographic screens that stretched for hundreds of feet, showing patterns and correlations that Sarah could barely comprehend. The consortium researchers clearly expected the humans to dive into the mathematics, to start analyzing the data systematically. Instead, Dr. James, a Nigerian astrophysicist, looked at the displays for about 30 seconds and asked, "What does it feel like?" The question crashed half the translation systems in the room. Several alien researchers made sounds that the translators couldn't render into any human language. Form flickered rapidly through several colors. "Feel," finally managed. "The fractures are physical phenomena. They do not have feelings. Your question is meaningless." James shrugged. "Okay, let me rephrase. If you were a dimensional barrier and you were tearing apart, what would that experience be like? What would you want? What would you be trying to do?" "Dimensional barriers are not conscious," one of the crystal beings said, its voice chiming like broken bells. "They do not want anything. They simply exist and follow physical laws." "Sure, sure," James said, waving a hand dismissively. "But humor me. Pretend they are conscious. Pretend they have feelings. What story would explain this data?" The alien researchers looked at each other, their various forms expressing what Sarah recognized as profound discomfort. They'd invited humans here precisely because humans thought differently, but now that they were experiencing it firsthand, they didn't like it at all. Over the next few weeks, the cultural divide became more apparent. The humans approached the problem in ways that horrified their alien colleagues. When Dr. Lisa Torres, an Argentine mathematician, was given incomplete data about a fracture's growth pattern, she didn't wait for more information. She just guessed, sketching out what she thought the full pattern probably looked like. And when complete data finally arrived, her guess was 93% accurate. "How did you do that?" demanded a four-dimensional researcher named, who experienced time nonlinearly and found human behavior particularly baffling. "You had insufficient data. The proper course was to wait for complete information before forming conclusions." Lisa shrugged. "I just got a feeling for the pattern, looked at what was there and extrapolated." "But your extrapolation wasn't based on mathematical models." "No," Lisa agreed. "It was based on vibes." "What are vibes?" asked desperately. "You know," Lisa said, making vague gestures with her hands. "Vibes, the general sense of a thing, the feeling it gives off, the energy." Looked ready to experience whatever the four-dimensional equivalent of a nervous breakdown was. The humans kept doing things that shouldn't work. Sarah watched as her colleagues ignored the beautiful mathematics that the consortium had spent centuries developing and instead started creating art projects. Doctor from Japan built physical sculptures representing the fractures using clay and wire. A German physicist wrote poetry about collapsing dimensions. A Brazilian researcher began composing a symphony based on the resonance frequencies of the barriers between realities. "This is not science," one of the consortium researchers complained to Sarah. "This is chaos." "Yeah," Sarah agreed, "but watch what happens." Because the strange thing was, it worked. The sculptures, the poetry, the music, they all revealed patterns that the pure mathematics had missed. The art projects bypassed rational analysis and went straight to intuitive understanding. The humans looked at the problem sideways, upside down, backwards, through lenses that made no logical sense, and they saw things the aliens couldn't see. Commander, after watching a human researcher solve a complex problem by literally sleeping on it and using a dream as a guide, pulled Sarah aside. "I need to understand something. Your colleague had all the data needed to solve that problem. He had computational resources available. He had assistance from our best minds. Instead, he took a nap. And somehow, his unconscious brain did in minutes what our conscious efforts couldn't do in weeks. How?" Sarah smiled. "Honestly, we don't fully understand it ourselves. Human brains are weird. We process information on multiple levels at once. Our unconscious minds work on problems while we sleep, making connections that our conscious minds miss. We call it intuition, but it's really just a different kind of thinking." "It violates causality," said flatly. "You arrive at conclusions before you have logical reasons for them. Then you work backwards to justify what you already somehow knew. It's as if you're solving problems by walking through the walls of a maze instead of following the paths." "Is that not allowed?" Sarah asked innocently. "Not in any form of logic I understand," said. "But I'm beginning to think that's exactly why we need you." The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah had requested permission to bring her daughter to the facility for a carefully supervised visit. Maya was 8 years old, bright and curious, and Sarah missed her desperately during the long work days. The consortium agreed, figuring that one human child couldn't cause any harm. Maya arrived on a Saturday morning, eyes wide with wonder at the impossible facility. Sarah gave her a tour, carefully steering her away from the more dangerous areas where the laws of physics were being actively manipulated. They ended up in one of the main research areas, where holographic displays showed the latest data on the dimensional fractures. Maya stood in front of a particularly complex display, tilting her head as she studied the swirling patterns of light. Sarah was talking with another researcher when Maya tugged on her sleeve. "Mom," Maya said, "why is it scared?" Sarah blinked. "What?" Maya pointed at the fracture displayed in the hologram. "This one. It's scared, can't you see?" Every researcher in the room stopped what they were doing, materialized beside them, form shifting rapidly. "The child is anthropomorphizing," said, "attributing human emotions to non-conscious phenomena, a common error in young minds." But Maya shook her head stubbornly. No, look, see how it's moving. It's trying to get away from something, it's scared and it doesn't know what to do. She moved to another display. This one is angry, it's stuck and it wants to break free. And this one, she pointed to a third fracture, this one is just sad, it's lonely. Maya, honey, Sarah started to say, but her daughter was already pulling out the crayons she'd brought with her. She sat down on the floor and started drawing pictures of the fractures, giving them faces and expressions. A scared fracture with wide eyes, an angry fracture with a frown, a lonely fracture with tears. The researchers watched in silence as an 8-year-old child reduced their sophisticated dimensional physics to crayon drawings with emotions. It should have been ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But Sarah felt something click in her mind. What if Maya was right? Not literally right, not that the fractures were conscious beings with feelings, but what if thinking about them that way revealed something important? Sarah said slowly, what if we mapped the fractures as if they had intention, as if they were trying to accomplish something? Reality doesn't have intentions, said. Physics doesn't have goals. This is magical thinking, not science. I know, Sarah said, but what if we try it anyway? What if we take Maya's drawings and use them as a model? Map the fractures as if they're trying to communicate, trying to reach something, trying to go home. It's absurd, said one of the crystal beings. It violates every principle of research methodology, said a hive mind collective that spoke in chorus. It's anthropomorphizing on a cosmic scale, said. Yes, Sarah agreed, but we're humans. Anthropomorphizing is what we do, and you invited us here because your way wasn't working. Was silent for a long moment. Then, very well, we will attempt this absurdity, because we have tried everything rational and rationality has failed us. They spent the next month rebuilding their entire understanding of the fractures using Maya's framework. Instead of treating them as random failures in the fabric of reality, they mapped them as if each one had purpose, direction, desire. They color-coded them by emotion based on their behavior patterns. They tracked them like living things migrating across dimensions. And slowly, impossibly, a pattern emerged. The fractures weren't random. They weren't just tears in reality. They were attempts at connection. The dimensional barriers were reaching out, trying to bridge gaps, searching for something they'd lost. This can't be right, said, staring at the new maps. Reality doesn't work this way. Sarah looked at the patterns, at the elegant structure that had emerged from treating physics like psychology. Maybe your reality doesn't work this way, but ours does. We've been telling you, humans see patterns everywhere. We assign meaning and purpose to everything. Usually we're wrong, but sometimes, just sometimes, we're right in ways that pure logic can never reach. What are the fractures trying to reach? Asked. Sarah studied the maps, feeling that familiar tingle of intuition that told her she was close to something important. I think they're trying to heal themselves. I think we broke something when we started traveling between dimensions, and reality is trying to fix it. The fractures aren't the disease. They're the attempted cure. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Sarah was right, then everything the consortium had done for 3 centuries had been treating the symptoms while making the underlying problem worse. They'd been fighting against reality instead of working with it. We need to test this theory, said finally. But if you're correct, then we've been approaching this backwards from the beginning. That's what humans do best, Sarah said. We approach everything backwards, sideways, and inside out, and somehow we still get where we need to go. Maya, sitting on the floor with her crayons, looked up and smiled. The fractures just want to go home, she said. Why won't you let them? Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. Sometimes the simplest answer was the right one. You just had to be willing to see it. Part 3. Testing Maya's theory required something the consortium had never attempted. Going to a fracture site and interacting with it not as researchers studying a phenomenon, but as diplomats attempting communication. The idea made most of the alien scientists uncomfortable. They were being asked to treat a mathematical anomaly as if it were a person, to approach physics as if it were psychology. But they'd come this far by trusting human intuition. They couldn't stop now. The largest fracture existed in what the consortium called Dimension 7, orbiting a dead star that had collapsed into something that wasn't quite a black hole. The fracture had been growing for 100 years, and conventional wisdom said it would consume that entire dimension within another 50. It was, in every measurable way, the most dangerous tier in reality. Sarah volunteered to lead the human team and would represent the consortium. They would take equipment designed to do something unprecedented, not to measure the fracture, but to listen to it. The instruments were a strange hybrid of consortium technology and human inspiration. Standard quantum sensors were combined with what one researcher had started calling vibe detectors, equipment that looked for patterns in chaos, meaning in randomness. One device had been built based on the structure of Maya's crayon drawings. Another used the musical patterns from the symphony about dimensional resonance. A third incorporated the poetry about collapsing universes. By all rational standards, the equipment was nonsense, but Sarah had stopped trusting rational standards weeks ago. They traveled to Dimension 7 through a carefully controlled dimensional shift. The sensation was like being turned inside out while falling through a tunnel made of sound. When they materialized near the fracture, Sarah immediately understood why it scared the consortium so much. It was massive, a wound in space that stretched for thousands of miles. Reality itself seemed to be peeling away, revealing something underneath that Sarah's eyes couldn't quite process. Colors that shouldn't exist bled out of the fracture. The laws of physics stuttered and glitched around it. Looking at it directly made Sarah feel like her thoughts were coming apart at the seams. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Made a sound of distress. "It's horrifying, it's death, it's entropy made visible." "It's both," Sarah said. She activated the equipment, the strange hybrid instruments that the consortium's engineers had built with obvious reluctance. Readings began flowing in, data rendered not just as numbers but as patterns, feelings, impressions. The vibe detector chirped and hummed, translating dimensional vibrations into something approaching language. The poetry-based analyzer started generating verses that described the fracture's behavior in metaphor. The music-driven scanner created harmonies that made Sarah's chest ache. "What are you getting?" asked. Sarah listened to the equipment, felt the data in a way that went beyond seeing it. This was the part where human thinking diverged most sharply from logical analysis. She wasn't calculating or measuring. She was empathizing, feeling her way into the problem like an emotional truth rather than a mathematical one. "Loneliness," she said finally. "Profound, aching loneliness and frustration. It's been trying to reach something, but it can't figure out how. It's stuck in a loop, doing the same thing over and over, hopping for different results." "That's the definition of insanity," observed. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "I think reality might be going a little insane, and I think we're the ones who drove it there." She pulled up the readings on a holographic display, showing them patterns that the equipment had extracted from the fracture's behavior. To a rational mind, they looked like noise. But Sarah had spent months learning to see patterns where logic said none existed. She could see the fracture reaching out, again and again, following pathways that had been severed, searching for connections that no longer existed. "When you started traveling between dimensions," Sarah said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "you treated each dimension as separate, like rooms in a building with walls between them. You punched holes in the walls to move between rooms." "A crude metaphor, but essentially accurate," said. "But what if dimensions aren't really separate? What if they're more like—" Sarah struggled for the right analogy. "Like different frequencies of the same song, different expressions of the same underlying reality. You didn't punch holes in walls. You broke connections that were supposed to stay intact. And now reality is trying to rebuild those connections the only way it can." "Who experienced time nonlinearly, suddenly flickered rapidly through several temporal states. If that's true, then every time we've tried to seal a fracture, we've been cutting off reality's attempts to heal itself. We've been fighting our own immune system. Exactly, Sarah said. The fractures aren't the problem. They're reality trying to solve the problem we created. We just couldn't see it because we were thinking about it wrong. Form went completely still. If you're correct, then the solution isn't to seal the fractures. It's to guide them, help them complete whatever they're trying to do. Yes, Sarah said, feeling that familiar rush of intuition clicking into place. We need to work with reality instead of against it. Treat it like a partner, not a broken machine. That's completely unscientific. One of the consortium engineers protested over the communication link. I know, Sarah said cheerfully. Isn't it great? They spent the next 3 hours implementing something that had never been attempted, dimensional therapy. Using the strange hybrid equipment, they began interacting with the fracture, not to measure or control it, but to communicate with it. They sent patterns through it, harmonies and rhythms based on the poetry and music that had revealed its nature. They offered pathways, suggestions, gentle guidance rather than forceful control. To Sarah's amazement and terror, the fracture responded. It shifted, changed, began moving in new patterns. The chaotic tearing became more directed, more purposeful. The fracture wasn't closing, but it was transforming, becoming something else. A bridge instead of a wound, a connection instead of a tear. It's working, said, disbelief clear even through the translation. We're having a conversation with a mathematical phenomenon. We're having a conversation with reality, Sarah corrected. Physics isn't just cold equations. It's got patterns and preferences and, okay, not feelings exactly, but something close enough that treating it like it has feelings works better than treating it like it doesn't. The transformation took 6 hours. When it was done, the fracture had become something new, a stable pathway between dimensions, following reality's natural contours instead of cutting across them. It would allow dimensional travel, but in a way that worked with the universe's structure instead of violating it. We need to do this for all the fractures, said quietly. Thousands of them across 7 dimensions. It will take decades. We'll have to rebuild our entire civilization's approach to dimensional travel. Yes, Sarah agreed. You'll have to throw out 3 centuries of progress and start over, using principles that you can't fully prove, only feel. This is the most irrational thing my species has ever attempted, said. Welcome to being human, Sarah replied with a grin. Over the next several months, the consortium began the massive project of transforming every fracture into a guided pathway. Human researchers worked alongside alien scientists, teaching them to trust intuition over analysis, to see patterns in chaos, to treat reality like a living thing that responded to empathy rather than force. It didn't always work smoothly. Some fractures required dozens of attempts before they transformed. Some alien researchers simply couldn't make the mental shift required, couldn't abandon their logical frameworks. But slowly, impossibly, it worked. The fractures stabilized. The dimensional barriers stopped tearing. Reality began to heal. One evening, Sarah sat within an observation room, watching a transformed fracture shimmer peacefully in the space between dimensions. It was beautiful now, like a aurora made of possibilities. I need to tell you something, said. When we first came to Earth, many in the consortium opposed it. They said humans were too primitive, too irrational, too dangerous. They wanted to wait another 1,000 years before making contact. What changed their minds? Sarah asked. Desperation, said bluntly. We were out of options, but also curiosity. We had been observing humanity for decades, and we kept seeing your species do the impossible. You built civilizations that shouldn't be stable. You created art that conveyed truths logic couldn't reach. You solved problems by ignoring the rules of how problems should be solved. You were wrong about so many things, but you were right in ways we couldn't understand. Paused, form shifting through colors that the translator interpreted as deep emotion. We thought we were inviting you to solve our problem, but you did something more important. You showed us that our way of thinking, our perfect logic, our elegant mathematics was incomplete. Not wrong, but incomplete. There are truths that can only be reached through irrationality, patterns that only reveal themselves to minds that are willing to be beautifully broken. Sarah smiled. So you're saying humans are still broken? Yes, said. But we're beginning to think the universe is broken in the same way. Logical on the surface, but with deeper currents of meaning and purpose that logic alone can't reach. You taught us to see those currents. You taught us to think like humans. That sounds dangerous, Sarah joked. It is, agreed seriously, but less dangerous than the alternative. In a multiverse that's more complex than pure logic can handle, your irrationality may be the only true wisdom. News of humanity's contribution spread across the consortium. Earth became a permanent member, not as a junior partner learning from advanced civilizations, but as an essential contributor teaching something those civilizations desperately needed. Human researchers began traveling to all 7 dimensions, spreading their unique approach to problem solving. Sarah returned home to find herself famous. News organizations called her the woman who saved reality by treating physics like it had feelings. She tried to explain that it was more complicated than that, but she had to admit the headline was catchy. Maya, of course, took it all in stride. I told you the fractures just wanted to go home, she said. You did, Sarah agreed. You saw what trained scientists couldn't see. You know what that makes you. Smart, Maya guessed. Human, Sarah said. Wonderfully, impossibly, beautifully human. The consortium's dimensional travel was slower now, less precise, but infinitely more sustainable. Reality had stabilized. The multiverse would survive, and it had been saved not by superior technology or advanced mathematics, but by humanity's greatest gift, the courage to be wrong, the wisdom to feel before thinking, and the audacity to trust intuition over evidence. Years later, when Maya was older and studying dimensional physics herself, she asked her mother if they'd really saved the multiverse just by thinking differently. Not just differently, Sarah said. We saved it by being willing to be broken in useful ways, by seeing patterns that shouldn't exist but do, by treating reality like a conversation instead of a calculation, by being human in a universe that needed humanity's particular brand of beautiful chaos. That's a lot of responsibility, Maya said. Sarah smiled. It is. But humans have been carrying impossible responsibilities since the day we first looked at the stars and decided to reach for them. We do the impossible by not knowing it's impossible. We solve problems by walking through walls. We see truths that logic can't reach. That's our gift to the multiverse. She looked up at the night sky, knowing that beyond it, in dimensions that human eyes couldn't see, millions of beings from 7 civilizations were learning to think like humans, learning to trust their gut, learning to guess instead of calculate, learning to be beautifully, impossibly broken. We changed the universe, Sarah said softly, not by being smarter or stronger, but by being ourselves, by being human. And in the end, that was the greatest thing humanity for you story of all. Not that humans conquered the stars, but that the stars learned to think like humans. Not that humanity's logic saved reality, but that humanity's lack of perfect logic was exactly what reality needed. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for someone irrational enough to understand it, and Earth had delivered.